by making sure you get a quick introduction to everybody that's up here with me. First of all, to my right here is Dr. Tom Linden. He's the Glaxo Wellcome Distinguished Professor of Medical Journalism and is the Director of the Medical and Science Journalism Master's Program here at UNC. Tom actually began his career in journalism as a staff writer for the LA Times when he was still an undergraduate at Yale. And after going on to complete his medical training, turned his attention back to journalism. And his extensive list of accomplishments as a journalist includes things such as being CNBC's first health and science correspondent. Since coming back to, since becoming a professor, he's sort of rededicated himself to training the next generation of scientists and medical experts to improve communications with public about scientific and medical and environmental issues. Next, we have Jen Willis, who is the Director of State Relations for UNC Chapel Hill. She completed her undergraduate degree here at UNC and an MPA at NC State, and has come back to Chapel Hill after extensive experience as a legislative assistant in the General Assembly as a fiscal analyst, as well as working extensively with the Wake County government, both as an analyst and as an intergovernmental relations director, I guess. And now as the Director of State Relations, Jen is the lead advocate for UNC Chapel Hill with the NC Assembly.
You want my job?
Yeah.
Done.
Next over is Beau Mills. He's the Director of Federal Affairs for UNC, Chapel Hill specifically, and as such is the Chief Advocate to the federal government on behalf of our campus. He also has firsthand experience on the receiving end of advocacy, working as the director for the U.S. Representative David Price, our local representative's office. He also has a myriad of other experience as a policy analyst and advisor throughout his career. And of course, we all at this point know Toby. But yeah, so Vice President of Policy at the AAU.
He was an awesome speaker.
Yes, as well. So thank you all for joining us today. And just to start us off here, we'll go with maybe the most basic question. What is the first piece of advice that you would give to someone who is new to advocacy or going to their first meeting with a representative? Why don't we start with you, Beau?
Just a few things, and I guess I have 7 points, and then many of them sound similar to the things that Toby talked about. Be clear about what your objectives are when you're going to speak to a member of Congress or their staff. Be focused. Don't have too many things. Just have 1 or 2, 3 things at the most that you really want to talk to them about and leave them with. Be accurate. Be sure you know what you're talking about. Be sure you don't leave yourself open to, after the fact, they realize, well, that's not really the way that works. So just be really accurate about what you're talking about. Have good materials. And I guess that's one of the things that, as a congressional staffer, this was the thing that used to be the biggest difficulty for me. We would sit down, and in fact, often, Toby said this earlier, having a meeting with a member of Congress in the district is absolutely the best place to do it. Every organization wants to go to Washington because that makes them feel like they're impacting public policy. Go to the district office because that's where you're going to get the 30 minutes where they'll sit back and the calls won't be coming in, the bell won't be ringing for votes, you'll have their undivided attention. So that's the first thing. If you can meet and talk to a member of Congress or a state legislator in a circumstance, in a context that's much more useful, quieter, better circumstances. But the thing that really used to tick us all off is when someone would come in and they would ask to plug into your projector to show a PowerPoint, or they would have this voluminous PowerPoint presentation and give it to the congressman and start just going through slides. Bad move. Just, that's helpful when you're giving a lecture or something, but don't do that with a member of Congress. And with my member of Congress in particular, when I worked for Congressman Price, a 1-page document that was easy to glance through with your key points, not a, as my son calls, a wall of words document. Don't have a bunch of words. Just have something that's sort of nice and easy to look at that you can leave behind, sort of walk through, but don't have voluminous materials. So that's one of the things. And grad students, you guys love words. You love documents. You love lots of information. Avoid that if you can. So I've got a series of other things I'd love to talk about, but I'll pass it on to my colleagues. And just one thing that I'll also say, as your federal relations person on campus, it's really important, even if you're going to go to Washington, just take 5 minutes and call our office. Either me or Nan Sanseverino is over on the other side of here, works with me. Just give us a call and let us know you're going. Those 5 minutes could be incredibly valuable because we could give you some advice. And if you're spending university money and going to Washington to advocate, we actually, by law, have to know that. Because I have to file a report and sign my name to it saying what the university is spending on advocacy. So, but if you're going on your own, even call us then, because we'll just give you some good advice. So our office is always open, and I can give you my cell phone, whatever it takes to get you engaged with us, we'd be happy to do that. And again, I'll just put another thing, Ross and you guys, this is really fantastic. Thank you for doing this. Thank you. This is really helpful. So with that, I'll pass it on. Sorry.
No, I agree with that. I think it helps. Things like this help to demystify the process, because if all, at least from my perspective, if all you're learning about or hearing about Raleigh is what you see on TV or what you see in the newspaper, you got a very different picture, I think, of what is going on in Raleigh than if you're there, boots on the ground on a daily basis. Is it nutty? Absolutely. I mean, that's what. But I personally thrive on that. If it were just the same old same thing every day, it just would not be a joy to do. Some days are more joyous than others. But I would first tell folks to not be intimidated or be nervous. I mean, these folks are working for you. They're working for your parents, for your spouses. I mean, you are there, in many cases, you're their voting constituent. Even if you are not a resident of North Carolina, you're attending an institution that is supported by them. So they need to know you and you need to know them. I can't overemphasize what Tobin has said earlier about knowing your audience and to whom you are speaking. We have been really effective. I think the most effective when we take somebody over to the legislature who can make a good personal impression on that particular member. If I've got someone, if our topic is trying to make sure that we maintain funding for cancer research, I mean, this sounds bad. I'm going to go through a list of people who I think have been affected by cancer, either personally themselves or a member of their family. And I have seen those conversations make an incredible difference because, and I've taken alums who are survivors. And so there's that connection there where I'm just bringing a group of people together. It's not me that's talking. It's them talking to someone on campus or an alum who's affected by this program that is based upon funding from the legislature. So I think where you can do that, that works the best. Absolutely, all politics are local. We have had members come before a group that I'm a part of called the Professional Lobbyist Association, but I don't refer to myself as a lobbyist because we're actually liaisons, and every state agency and every university is allowed to designate a person on their campus or in their department as a liaison, because it's not the only thing that we do, but we're the ones tasked with helping deliver the message over to the legislature. And it's just so important to know your audience and the importance of staff. That's one way. That's the big difference between getting in the door at a moment's notice or having to wait 2 weeks to get an appointment. And I think, at least in my case, and Beau, you can probably speak to the same, having been a legislative staffer at the state level, but also at the federal level, there are established relationships that we've had, for 20 plus years. And again, we don't have to go with you, but it's so helpful if we know you're going so that we can help either facilitate those appointments or make a call and say, hey, hey Carolyn, I've got someone coming over. Can you get him in to go see Senator Apodaca? It's really important. Or if I walk by someone's office, there are 5 people lined up and she looks at me and says, you come in here now. I I mean, that's pretty cool, number one. But number two is because you've taken time to establish that relationship. So that's really important.
John?
Yeah, I agree with what everybody said, and I think Tobin had a terrific presentation. Many of the points I would make about dealing with the media he made in terms of dealing with individuals. I think how I approach this differently is that I don't teach people how to relate one-on-one with politicians or policymakers. I teach people how to do media. And so media has a tremendous effect, obviously, on policymakers and the public. My main message is that think of what you're doing as a story. Stories are what people listen to, not facts, not a list of findings, but a story. So if you can encapsulate what it is you do in a story, you'll be much more effective. And how do you think about a story? Well, I like to take from Boyce Rensberger, who was the former Washington Post science editor. He now runs a science journalism program at MIT. And he talked about the 5 criteria for what makes science news. So if you can put these 5 criteria in your mind as you think about what you do and how to package it, number 1 is fascination value. So a story doesn't have to have wide applicability if it has tremendous fascination value. Something about Pluto, for example. There's no way that what's happening on Pluto now is going to have an immediate impact on our lives, but people are interested in the planets. It's fascination value. Number 2, size of the natural audience. In other words, and this is kind of an opposite way of thinking, how many people are affected by whatever you're doing in your scientific work? If it's a huge number of people, that makes it a much better story. 3 is importance. It's a relative term, but is your scientific finding or advance important? 4 is reliability of the results. If it's a preliminary finding and not reliable, hasn't been confirmed in other experiments, then it may not be ready for prime time. And number 5 is timeliness. In other words, can you hook what you're doing to something that's happening in the larger world? Those 5 are Rensberger's criteria for what makes science news, and it's important for you if you want to engage the media to be able to see stories the same way reporters do. In other words, if you come to a reporter and say, I'd like to tell you about this research I'm doing, it's really, really interesting. It may be interesting to you, but unless you can couch it in one of those or one or more of those 5 terms, you're not going to hook the reporter, and the reporter is the bridge between the science community and the policymakers and the public. And that's kind of my capsule message there.
So I'll just add 2 things. Beau touched on one, and the first is do no harm. So there are a lot of folks that I've taken up to the hill. They think they're going to advance their cause, and by the time we're leaving the meeting, I'm going, I think that hurt us. And you know, and some of that's being overly technical, or they come across as arrogant, like they think they're smarter than me, when that's not it. They just don't know how to talk, or they don't know how to talk to their audience. And the other is the story I tell is before there were PowerPoints, there were overheads. And the researcher who came into Bob Traxler's office became the brunt of all jokes for the remainder of the day, because he asked if we had an overhead projector, because he had some view graphs he wanted to show the congressman in an individual meeting. So that doesn't go over very well. I mean, it was funny, but not for him, although he probably had no idea that he just made a real bad mistake. The other thing I would say, since there's a lot of graduate students here, don't underestimate your power as graduate students. As students, you have more power, and this gets to the personal piece. So when I worked for MIT, I would take in the lab director of the Fusion Center, $40 million lab. You'd think, well, that would be important, but no, the member of Congress looks at it as a $40 million lab. Of course he's coming to advocate for fusion. And I couldn't get Senator Kennedy's staffer who dealt with this to return my calls when I tried to get a meeting with her. But When the lab was threatened, a group of graduate students at the lab teamed up and sent a letter and jointly signed it. So one time I got a call back from Senator Kennedy's office. Well, I cared about education, cared about graduate students, and these students didn't know they were going to go and do fusion. They weren't employing several employees. There weren't jobs. It was their future that was at stake, and they made it clear. And that was the time I got the call back from Senator Kennedy's office saying, who led this letter? I need to talk to them. So don't underestimate what much of an impact, because oftentimes you can have more impact, and explain why it's important to provide research funding, that research funding, that you're working off grants, that you're being funded from the National Science Foundation, the NIH, whatever, and you'd be amazed at the impact you can have.
When I think, particularly within the state government sandbox, conveying what you're working on and why it matters to North Carolina, why it matters to Pender County that you're working on a water quality project, why it matters to the northeastern part of the state that you were working on an obesity project, and what factors, what environmental and just general lifestyle factors are affecting that part of the state, having incredible issues with diabetes, with heart disease. It's making that case to that particular member why they should matter, and it's because they've got constituents back home who this touches. And there's a way to make that link. No matter what you're doing, we can come up with it somehow, and it will be genuine. But it's making that connection back to that member of why it's important.
And when you're making a case for anything or being interviewed, especially, it's essential to be able to speak in plain English. Scientific speak, scientific jargon will eliminate any possibility of a soundbite from you being put on the air if you're interviewed for television or radio, or maybe even print. So learn how to talk the way most people talk. And it's very difficult when you've been in graduate education for a number of years to speak plain English. Just to give you some examples, let's say from the medical world. Don't talk about a meniscus, talk about cartilage. Don't talk about a myocardial infarction, talk about a heart attack. Don't talk about a cerebrovascular accident, talk about a stroke. And you can go whatever specialty you're from, there's tons of jargon. Eliminate that from your vocabulary and practice what you're going to say with someone who isn't from your specialty to see whether they understand what you're saying. And that's a sure guarantee to be misunderstood and then not utilized by the media is to speak in technical speak. And some of the worst practitioners of that are my fellow faculty members. And I coach my students when they're interviewing faculty or graduate students to actually give some of the same examples or examples like I gave to you to the people they're interviewing in the hope that some of that will be understood, but often it's not, and it's to the loss of the person trying to make a case for one thing or another.
So one thing that Toby touched on a little bit that I would really like to make sure everyone gets a chance to comment on is I'd really like to hear you all talk about what is unique about the student's role as an advocate or as someone reaching out to the public.
I'll jump in first. One of the key points that I always look for when you go, especially when you're talking to a legislator or the staff, is sincerity. And being sincere, and in fact being willing to sort of tell your story. And the story of a grad student is particularly important because you're the future of solving the world's problems. I mean, to be honest, right? They're going to be the people. You're going to be the people that are going to solve the vexing problems. So they need to hear from you, and you have credibility. Toby said it, and that was a really incredible slide to hear that scientists are right there with firemen in terms of people that are respected. So don't overlook that. And the other thing that, as a lobbyist, one of the things we love to take with us when we talk to a legislator are real people. And one of the things Congressman Price always says, the most effective thing he's ever seen in Congress is when every year the doctors from the cancer centers go up there and they in their white coats and they flood Capitol Hill. The most powerful thing that he's ever seen was when they had patients actually tell their stories at a luncheon. And he said there was not a dry eye in the house. I mean, every member remembered that. You talk about telling a story. I mean, that is really powerful. And you are real people that can tell stories. So I think you're really critical to this. Jen and I can talk about issues all we want to. We'll have those relationships, but we need to have people like you be a part of the team to tell those real stories.
Well, and also I think, at least in your world as well, the members expect to see us. I mean, they know we're there. They know they can call on us. But the university's more than me, just like it's more than Beau. And it's important that they see different aspects. And one of the main reason we exist as a university is because of the students. And so where there are issues that are being debated in appropriations or in a policy committee that directly affect students, I want to bring folks over. I want to also be cognizant that I'm not just bringing a certain type of student over, or only students only from the humanities, that we're in social sciences, that we're in medicine, that we're in professional fields. I also want to know that there are students that identify themselves as either Republican or Democrat, and I like to have both of them come over there with me. One of the things that we fought, we were unsuccessful, but I think we opened a lot of eyes when we were fighting against a tuition increase for non-resident undergraduate students. We were able to deflect that and other, I think, some onerous proposals that were going to affect graduate students. We got those off the table, but we were left with certain universities essentially having their out-of-state undergraduate tuition go up in excess of 12%. And so what we had were students that were both in-state and out-of-state that came over with me to meet with members, and having the in-state students say, this is why it's important for me to not just be at school with other people that are from Charlotte or from Raleigh. That I want you to understand how my academic and personal life have been enriched by this student from India or this student from California, so that it's not, we don't identify, you don't identify yourselves on this campus as, oh, they're an out-of-stater, they're an in-stater. And it's really easy for policymakers to try and off things on a certain group of students. And it's easy as a public university system to want to protect the in-states as much as possible, but it's important for them to know what that means for that in-stater's experience if you're offing a lot of the responsibility for paying for the education onto another group of folks. So that's, it's bringing where they're looking at you maybe in two different silos, it's coming over as a unified, a student body coming over there. And they've absolutely got to hear from you.
If I can just amplify on what you're saying about the personal element, and also underscore what Tobin said when he told the story about Alan Alda teaching science communication at Stony Brook. The most important thing you can do if you're interviewed for a story is, especially on camera, but even in print, is don't focus on the scientific process or the explanation of how something works. Of course, you're going to do that in the pre-interview or off camera, but what the reporter's looking for, because the reporter knows what viewers want to see, is the personal, emotive element. So if you're working on research, what's going to make the soundbite isn't you're explaining how it works. The reporter can do that. It's you're getting excited about a new finding, getting emotionally involved with what you're doing. That's what has an impact on people, and that's what you need to share with any media whom you contact. And I assume it probably also works with policymakers as well. Am I right, Tobin?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And what I say about that is you have something else that I think, I often said when I would take in that lab director, that high-level scientist, and they would get it wrong. They'd talk above their head or a little bit off mark. They would be arrogant, egotistical. Take in students, you got a little bit more wiggle room because they say, God, they're bright. God, they're the future. So you have a little bit of, although once you get into graduate student zone, it's, undergrads, you know, they could, if they talk really like, boy, that's an undergrad. But I'd also say that you have a story of and oftentimes this is what you forget to tell, is your own story about why did you go into science? Why did it really matter? Why did you pick this? And sometimes the most important story to tell is that I had a mentor, I had a teacher, I had a professor, and they really convinced me this was the right thing to do. And sometimes that's what's more important to policymakers, to hear that. The other thing I say that I love about students, when I worked for MIT, we had a all Democratic delegation. I knew the Massachusetts members really well. I knew their staff, but I could go to students who came from a different state, still had ties back home, and I could get in to see members in districts I could never get in otherwise, and use them to do some outreach to members who didn't have a university in their home district, who desperately needed to know the story that they had a constituent who went to high school in their district, who then went to college, now being a grad student, not in the state, but that the parents still live there, and that the federal funding that they provide, because they happen to chair one of the most important appropriations committees to fund the agency that funds you, is gone to support somebody that has deep roots back in their district. So don't forget that, because the tendency is, oh, I'm in Chapel Hill now, I gotta go meet with the Chapel Hill representative. There's that personal story that you have back home can sometimes really be very powerful and get you in the door, get people like me in the door that I wouldn't be able to go in otherwise, and do some real important outreach to members that otherwise are hard to get to.
Thank you, guys. So one thing that I've heard you mention, Jen, in the past is how important the messenger is, sometimes disproportionately so to the message. How do you go about assessing which to focus on in which situations, and what is sort of the right balance to find in between those things?
That can be challenging, because in some instances the best person to go over and speak about a particular subject is one who may have the most difficult time in relating to a member. So again, it's working through our offices and working with your peers, and having having practice runs. I mean, we'll do that. I'll do that a lot. Recently, when we were having the opportunity to present the work of our centers and institutes before the Board of Governors, we did a lot of these dry run presentations, and it was easy to pick up on things of, oh, don't say that, don't use that term, or bring, emphasize this a little bit more. So there's coaching, like media training. It's elected official training you can do with an individual. Sometimes it's just not going to work, and I'll give an example of something that we're working on right now, of an opportunity to make some presentations before one of the legislature's appropriations committees. And the topic at hand, the individual in the department with whom I'm working says, well, the members may recognize this person, they were arrested at Moral Monday. I'm like, is there someone else we might can bring over who can convey an equally good message? So it's not being dismissive of the work that's being done, but a lot of times it is literally who you bring over to convey that message. And we're all working to get better at that. And it's just, sometimes it works, and sometimes we just have to figure out the best way to handle the particular issue.
Yeah, being organized is really important. Who your key speaker is, who's going to help us. If you take 2 or 3 people to meet with a member of Congress or in the General Assembly, have a key speaker for your group. The other thing that Toby said I thought was really important, don't be afraid to listen a little bit too. And also allow and this is a Southern trait we have, and that is have a social moment where when you get there, make the personal connections. Where are you from? Is a question you get everywhere you go. Yeah. Who are your people? Go ahead and allow that to happen. Now, don't let that dominate. Right. Sometimes you want to steer back to your one-pager. But do give that opportunity to make those personal connections, because you want to have a positive experience with them. The other thing, and this is something we haven't talked about much, is I love to bring people to campus. And, we should talk about things we could do with the graduate students on campus. I had Congressman Price have coffee with a group from SPAG, and that's a pretty big deal, guys. I mean, that's really, you had his full undivided back and forth conversations, and settings are really important too, so those are something else to think about. But language is really important. Again, getting back to what Tom says, you need to speak in a language that everybody understands, and you can gauge your audience too. Going to one member who might not have much more than a high school education might not be able to speak at the same level as Dr. Price, who represents Chapel Hill. So you just be aware of your audience too and the language you use.
And I've seen, Chancellor, no one I think is better at doing that than Chancellor Folt. I think she has done an amazing job in the time that that we spend together and going over to Raleigh. One, that's where it depending on the situation, we needed to get our chancellor over to Raleigh more, and that has made a difference. And it is sitting there for the first 5 or 10 minutes of the conversation, just talking about background and I saw it sort of it was going well anyway. But then I know you've heard of her talk about her first couple of years of college experience starting at the community college at a community college in California, and I saw it sort of the I wouldn't say the eyes light up, but just sort of a different take that a member that we were meeting with had when we got to talking about, what's your background? And she said, I started at, such and such community college. He's like, really? You were president of Dartmouth. I had assumed you just were Ivy League all the way. She says, no. And it was just, the meeting was going well, but it just had a totally different kind of feeling. Like, oh God, you're some of my people kind of thing going on there. So you've sort of got to let that naturally happen. I will tell you, as a female, it starts, still be challenging in 2015 to go in and you get this, hey honey, where are you from and all this, and you're just going up, let's move past this, and then we can, I can make them pivot. But again, knowing your audience and how to do that is a big deal.
I'd like to make sure that the audience has a chance to ask questions if they have any. Looks like Brandon there has one.
Yeah, I've got a microphone. Hi. So I want to ask a question about how we can help facilitate a broader engagement of scientists within policy and government. So like most of the general public, there's a lot of apathy of students and scientists towards the process and government in general. So how do you think we can educate scientists and students towards the responsibility of advocacy of the scientific community?
Well, one of the things you guys are doing is doing this today is a good example. But then the work you're doing around the state with students, I don't know, Ross, if you've talked about that, that is extraordinary.
Yeah, the outreach work that we've been able to do.
Get more graduate students engaged in that if you can. Do you know what they're talking about, Dr. Linden?
No, I'd like to hear more though.
Yeah.
So
we're the panelists, but I want Ross to tell you about that.
So over the course of the past, 5 or 6 months, since the beginning of the school year, we've been working with the Moorhead Planetarium, trying to get some of the graduate students from campus out into Franklin County, specifically. Novozymes is a company based out of Franklin County that has put forward a fair amount of money so that the Moorhead Planetarium's Science Festival program can be brought out to each one of the elementary and middle schools throughout the county. And our participation through that has been really an enlightening process. We've gotten a chance to talk to a lot of parents and a lot of kids about science policy issues, talking to them about what is in the federal budget. Kids have done an exercise where they get to put little green beads representing money and put it towards what they would like to see funded by the government, and then we get to show them what actually it breaks down as. And inevitably they're disappointed. And really just getting to engage with both the students about what they hope to see and what they would like to see in the future, and get to engage with the parents about what the current situation is. And that was what was mentioned earlier by Julia, how we've been getting people to sign essentially what are form letters, but many times they will add a personal note on the end of that form letter, and we've been trying to send those to both federal and state level legislators.
I know that through, and it's a selection process, I think, because the space is limited, but through Graduate Education Day at the General Assembly, all of the publics that have graduate education programs, as well as the privates, get to corral two of the quadrants in the legislative building, and they have, it's like Science Fair Day. You have your panel, and you have you talk about your research project, and that's another way where we go through and we help coach sort of how to deliver that message to the legislature, and what message resonates, which ones, what might be topical based on what conversations that are going on at the legislature at the time. But getting folks there is one thing, but then I'll also reach out to our local delegation, to all of our alums in Chapel Hill, to say, hey, we've got some graduate students that are over. I'd love for you to stop by the 1000 court and see these 3 graduate students that we have there that they can tell you about their amazing work that they're doing, and not only how it impacts North Carolina, but more broadly. Science, in the NC Science Day, that's something that I've worked with Todd Boyette and folks to, it's been mainly on the industry side to make sure, to have folks make sure they come by and visit, but then also get recognized during part of the legislative session, usually at the very beginning, that there's recognition that there's a large group of folks here for North Carolina Science, for the North Carolina Science Festival. And so that spurs questions again, and you've got members that'll walk by on their way to committee, on the way back to their offices, and we'll see what's being displayed and ask questions. So a lot of it is just getting that notice when you're at the legislature.
So I think one of the challenges is to get, in terms of cultural change, is to get the scientists and engineers, and I'll throw in social scientists because I'm going to tell a story here in a second, to understand how important it is to them to be engaged, and that it has value professionally too. So on the one hand, I'll use the political scientist as an example. So 2 years ago, they got their funding at NSF cut, just totally eliminated. Yet I have to say they were awful at engaging, and Brian Baird is a member of Congress, psychologist. I was in a meeting with him. He said it's kind of like the boxing coach getting beaten up in a barroom brawl, but they wouldn't engage because they don't really get involved in it. They study it, but they don't get involved. But here they lost all their money, and the question is, why wouldn't you get involved? And it's critical that you be engaged for just the purpose of making sure that the funding that supports a particular discipline is there, and it's understood why it's valuable. Now, one of the other problems is, and I again say in social science, I think social scientists are some of the worst at explaining the value of their research. And I'm actually on a National Academies panel that's looking at this, and it's composed of producers of social science research, users of social science research, and communicators who are trying to bridge the gap. But the users are probably much better, whether it be industry or the writers, political writers, analysts, pollsters. They get it. Many of them came out of those programs at universities. They can explain it. So I think that's one thing. I'm trying to think what my other thought was. In terms of getting. Oh, I know. The other piece is the professional piece, and this is where I don't think there's an understanding, but I'll share a story. So, I started my career at MIT, and then I went to Michigan. And when I went to Michigan, there was a research advisory council that asked me a month on the job, you were at MIT. Michigan, you're at Michigan. Michigan's a great institution, but MIT's MIT. What's the difference? It took me a while of really understanding the institution, but I would say Michigan was much more publisher parish than MIT. MIT was it was a land grant. It's one of two private land grants, Cornell and MIT. MIT got the mechanical of the A&M. The ag went to UMass, the mechanical went to MIT. Fascinating. But I often think that if you would have created the land grant system post-industrial revolution, you'd end up with a lot more MITs, where faculty would have been much more engaged directly with industry, more applying their thoughts. So the motto for MIT is science with an eye towards the practical. And part of the problem with Michigan was it's very much a publisher parish. Like, we got to publish. But the thought of working with industry, that's changed a lot since I was there. But it was just starting to change then. And that wasn't. And they find that the people who can work with industry also are able to work with policymakers, or they see that extra value, serve on national advisory committees, federal advisory committees. Michigan is fascinating. You know, at MIT, I often said, there's a person on a federal advisory committee. When they leave, it's the MIT slot. So they go back and they appoint the next MIT person to fill that slot. At Michigan, I found a person who was on the Air Force Scientific Advisory Committee in the engineering college. I said, wow, that's great. The dean and the associate dean didn't know. They didn't even know. I said, why didn't you tell them? Well, I didn't see that there was value. I saw their professional value in meeting with these people. It was really great for me. But on campus, I didn't see that it was really that valuable. So the other thing is to get people, the other thing is on campuses like Chapel Hill and Michigan, there are a lot of people who have that government service, and they get it. They've been in the government, they've come back to campus, they're teaching. But oftentimes they're a totally underutilized resource in terms of why they saw that professionally as being valuable. And they went and served. And so that's something I say SPAG could help do, is find some of those people. Because I will tell you, we were always interested, who's on advisory committees? They can help us. And there's a lot of people you don't know are on advisory committees. And it's fascinating how they don't really share it necessarily. They keep it insular. That was not as true at MIT, and I think it was just that external service was much more culturally valued. So I think we got to get to the point where it's recognized that it is a responsibility to spend some time. It's nothing wrong with going and spending time in government and key agencies that are making key policies. NSF is dying all the time to get rotators. I mean, it's hard to get good people to spend the time. We at our institutions also have to facilitate that by making sure we're facilitating leave, helping to get good people in those positions.
Second that. We want more of you to go work with NSF and other federal agencies.
And make sure he knows about it if you do it. Don't keep it a secret.
The other thing, I think you all are in such a unique position because you're doing the research, you're boots on the ground, but you're also, in many cases, teaching undergraduates. And so that's where, you know, it's not just, they just can't look at you as, oh, I'm a student, you know, it's a student. And the life of a graduate student, you know, it's that graduate student that's teaching that Chemistry 101 or that introductory biology course. And that, I mean, that's, you have the ability to pivot, you know, on a moment's notice to be able to say, this is what I'm providing to your constituents. I mean, I'm the one that's teaching your constituents' children in that 400 person or 200 person. I'm the one leading the recitation. So I think you all are just in this sweet spot that you've got such a great story to share that we need to do more of that.
Since you raised teaching, I just want to say the best advocates are also often the best teachers. And it's fascinating. I mentioned that Alan Alda program. One thing, since we've got this undergraduate STEM initiative we're leading, we're very interested because the other thing they're doing is they're training the graduate TAs in improv. And they've now sent them into the class, and they're looking at learning gains. The students who had the improv training can personalize what they're doing to the students who are just coming into this field, and those who just teach the normal way. And they found that they have some noticeable learning gains in those classes. And it's just ability to connect to the students in a way that isn't happening in the traditional way of teaching those classes, where just the student sits there and go, I just don't get why I'm here. It doesn't even seem it's important to the faculty. You know, they're just kind of reading from the book, you know, telling us the facts.
So I have a question about, in your presentation, Toby, you talked about Congress, how it's become more polarized. And, you know, to me, that the lack of moderates and their lack of people who might be more receptive to hearing these science stories makes it seem like we're kind of fighting an uphill battle here. So, you know, what would you say as to, you know, whether it's becoming more challenging for scientists and grad students to influence policymakers, or, you know, if that can change?
So the answer is it's certainly becoming more challenging. I'm an optimist though, and you still have to do it. And the idea is you start wherever somebody is and try and move them a little and figure out where you can move them on which issues. And that's what when I worked on the Hill, it was always a straight, you know, I had my own personal beliefs and I wanted to influence my boss. You know, I'd figure just on things like, you know, the things that I really believed in strongly, could I get them just to move a little bit? But I always needed to know where I started. One of the biggest mistakes that scientists make is they just assume, they go in with their view and they don't really look at where they're starting from. And if you have somebody who is, you know, is anti-climate change or believes that it's not man-made, going in and saying you're just wrong is not going to work. You got to think of the messaging, the way to approach them, and it's different than others, and you've got to start there. But it's a continual challenge, and it's going to be all that more important for the scientific community to get involved, and not only involved, but run for office, do things. I also say, though, running for office is not the only thing you do. But again, I think having people with technical backgrounds trying to challenge members to think differently is very important, having them in those offices. And I like I say, the AAAS fellows have done amazing things for science on the Hill, from funding for science, but bringing science and evidence-based information to bear on policy. So it is difficult, but there's still a lot of very good members in Congress, and we won't be able to affect everybody. And it will take a while for the tide to turn, but I do think it will turn back, and we'll get to a more better state.
I was kind of picking up on one of the things that was one of the slides Toby had. There's a lot of new people in Congress, and just in the little time that I've been on the other side of this, which is advocating as opposed to being a receiver, I've seen members of our delegation, which is probably one of the younger delegations in terms of time of service because of redistricting. We have a lot of new members. I've seen them shift. They are actually listening, they're learning, and the other thing is, once they have been in office for more than 1 or 2 terms, they're a little more comfortable with their positions too. One of the things that's important to recognize is what they say in public and what they're thinking may be different. You know, we have one member whose campaign was really simple: cut, cut, cut. Well, he actually is one of the most intelligent members of our congressional delegation and understands science, is interested, and it could potentially be a big ally for us. And so we just keep talking to them. We see things moving. We did start off at a bad place. Yeah, but we're getting better.
Let me tell you something else that's a big mistake. Don't assume you know what the member really believes based upon what they said in their campaign, because that's a big mistake. So I'm just going to turn back the clock to the 104th Congress, where we saw proposals on the table to cut science by 30%, and there was this guy named Newt Gingrich who was the new Speaker of the House. And people go, oh, Newt Gingrich, boy, that could be a disaster. He turned out to be called for, you know, doubling funding for NIH, was one of the best advocates for science we ever had. A great story was, you know, Chuck Best went in, had a half-an-hour meeting. The other thing to do is tchotchkes are good. If you have something like a chip or something you built in the lab that you can give to members that they can take away. So Chuck had 2 different tchotchkes. One was a tube of some sort, and one was a chip. And Newt said, you know, you keep this one, I'm going to take this one. So the next day, he's out speaking on the road. Out comes this tube. And he started talking, this is our future, but and the poor researchers whose device, you know, whose thing it was, were kind of upset because he didn't quite get the application right, but he kept pulling that thing out. You know, so just, I mean, I just don't know. You don't know who your friend is going to be. Frank Wolf from Virginia came in as chair of the VA the Science Committee, Science, Commerce, Science, Justice, and we all were wondering, boy, we don't know what he's going to do. And combination of a few things. He ended up at a high school in Virginia with the scientist who pulled up the Titanic. I'm forgetting his name, but and it was in like the last night of the World Series when Boston was like, and he didn't think anybody would be there, and the room was packed. And this guy gave a great speech, and Frank was really impressed with that. And some engineering deans came in about the same time and started talking about the threat from China, which really got him revved up. And so he was writing President Bush and saying we need to triple science funding. He's been a great advocate for the National Science Foundation. So you just don't know. So don't assume you know. Go and have the conversation after you have it a few times, and then you can kind of gauge. But don't assume somebody's a lost cause.
If I could put in a word for the media, there was just, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think there was just a vote or a resolution in the Senate that affirmed that climate change was occurring. I think there was only one dissenting vote, but it's not a complete victory because it did not have language that human actions are pushing or creating or adding to climate change, but that's like halfway there, and I think in part it's because of this drumbeat of media stories about climate change that have occurred over time. So adding your own story to the mix definitely has an impact, and it's the totality of all this information and stories that eventually I think moves even the most conservative legislators to acknowledge climate change at last.
Yeah, video clips of polar bears without anywhere to go anymore. That's really powerful.
Yeah.
But that is, I mean, don't assume based on what letter is in parentheses after a member's name that they're going to be lockstep with some particular one-page agenda or not. And we saw it this past session again with 60% of the House and Senate either being in their second term or less. So you're talking about people who had 4 years or fewer years of experience in the state legislature, and a lot of younger folk that were running and being elected. We had a number of freshman legislators that helped defend various programs throughout the university system and actually bucked their leadership. And we were thinking at one point, oh God, now we're really going to be blackballed because they're standing up to their leaders on the floor. But and they won, and it made a difference. So it's that, don't look at and assume things about a particular member based on their party affiliation. Again, it's getting to know them as a person, and then what they're passionate about, and then sharing information to help them become one of your advocates is a big thing.
What is the rule? Never burn bridges, too. Oh my gosh.
And people have long memories.
Yes, they do.
Since you brought up party affiliation, I just want to say science has no party affiliation. There is no party that supports science more than the other. There are individuals who support science and believe in science more than others. And if you look historically at the doubling of NIH, not led by a Democrat, Bill Clinton wasn't the one who proposed it. It was led by 2 Republicans who were in the right place at the right time as chairs of committees and believed deeply in it. Now they were more moderate, but just don't rule out again who, I would have said George Bush wasn't ever going to propose doubling for physical sciences, but he did in the State of the Union. It was one of the, in terms of happy moments in my life when George Bush said, we're in the State of the Union, I'm calling to double funding for, this is W. Bush, we were like amazed, and after trying to just get presidents to mention science. So you just don't know, and I think I worry a little bit because of issues like climate, where it does, and some of the ethical issues, that there is this view. But if you look historically, Vannevar Bush, who's the founder of science, really our modern day science policy, conservative engineer from MIT, really fascinating that he teamed up with Franklin Roosevelt, a New Deal Democrat, but they did it because there were national issues that needed science in the war to be solved, and he saw the value in Bush and invited him to be part of his team to really do that. So
I know we're getting close to the end. I was just going to say one last thing, and I want to ask you all, not only you, because you're self-selected to be here, so you're already interested and engaged. Go back to your labs, and when you talk to your colleagues, we are at a really, really critical point in our nation's decision making on where to spend money. And a lot of the decision making is being taken away from us because of entitlement spending, non-discretionary spending. And it's going to get squeezed. And if there was ever a time to engage in public dialogue around the importance of science, now is the time. And that's also going to take courage to deal with those other sides of that pie that Toby put up there. We've got to have courage to deal with that too, because you're going to get squeezed out, and federal dollars, which are so critical to graduate students, are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller if we don't thoroughly engage in also the discussion of entitlements and the broader discussions around choices we're going to make on how we fund this. How do we, do you bring more money in? Do you spend it more effectively? Whatever the case is, you need to go back and talk to your colleagues about that.
All right, I think we have time for one last question here.
Thank you for this on. Good. So you guys touched a little bit, a couple of times I would say, on the relationship between the way that legislators are working and the opinions of their constituents. And then again, Toby just made a lovely point at the end of science not having a one side or the other. It's not partisan per se. And I think right now the scientific community is really frustrated in how to get that point across, that they really just want the public, their constituents, and then their representatives to all just be educated of the facts and making decisions along those lines. And so, again, going back to constituents and legislators, it, to me is a little bit of like chicken and the egg, like where do you go to get facts shared and to really educate everyone? That way we can be making decisions that really are going to be best for the American public. Too much?
I'll take a stab at it just to start to give them a chance to really answer the question. One of the things that I try to do a lot in the work, it's great for us that are in universities to go talk about science and the importance of science. One of the things I'm trying to do is get a third-party validation about what we're saying. To me, third-party means I'm saying local businesses that benefit from the work that you're doing, from the people that come out of your programs that are working in their companies. Having that third-party validation, patients who have benefited. Those are the folks that you should also engage in this conversation. And maybe, if you have colleagues that work at local businesses or startups, hey, tell them, hey, you need to go talk to your legislator and tell them how important it was that we built a cancer center on this campus and it created opportunities for this company to excel in what we're doing. I mean, we've got to start broadening the base on who's going to talk about it. So that's one way to approach it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, I think it completely makes sense. And it's also knowing and understanding the nomenclature that's in place right now and how to spin your product or your research into how it benefits, economic development in North Carolina, or how you have an impact on business or on just general community life in North Carolina. And I think, as Beau said, getting that third-party validation, it's so powerful to have that company from the park and they're having their CEO say something to one of the appropriations chairs. My employee pipeline are the students that are in the Research Triangle area that are at UNC State and Duke in this particular program. And if you impose a tax on international students, or if you impose a higher tuition rate on graduate students, that is going to, in the end, disrupt my pipeline. And this is why it's important to me that you don't do that. So in that case, that perks their ears up in ways that we couldn't do.
This was talked about earlier. I think one of you mentioned, no more than 2 or 3 messages. I would suggest to really think about what you're doing and come up with just one message, one key message. And if you can put your message into a 6-word sentence with an active verb, you've got a story. If you can't do a 6-word message with an active verb, you don't have a story. And if you don't have a story, nobody's going to listen to it. So, I mean, I think the important thing is to think about what you're doing, what the message is, come up with your story, and then move forward at that point with, you know, whoever your receiver, whoever the recipient of the message would be.
So I would just say it's important too, because when you look at science and its role and facts in decision making, that you do have to be realistic, that there are multiple policy inputs that any decision maker is always going to, how much money do we have? What are the ethical issues involved? What do my constituents think about this? What are their religious beliefs? How do those conflict with then what the facts or scientists tell me? Also realize that there's a science isn't policy prescriptive, and oftentimes scientists get confused because they think that you know, that policy should be just as rational based on facts. It will never be rational. It will always be a compromise, and it will always be based in judgment calls. And so in presenting facts, when you start presenting a policy prescription, you're getting into usually areas that are judgmental based upon how you interpret the facts. And sometimes, you know, the people in the science community get frustrated by that, but you just got to recognize that. That means, though, it's incumbent upon researchers who know the facts to make sure they're out in the public in a way that gets to policymakers. And the media is a very good way to do that. But if you're not willing to talk to the media because you're scared you might be misquoted, or you just don't, you want to hide, or you don't know how to do it effectively, you're never going to get facts out. And I think so the starting point is to engage. And where do you go? Well, that's where universities have a lot to offer, because they have the people thinking about these challenging problems with the facts, with the data, with the information. We just need a better way to sometimes put that in a digestible form so it's more usable for policymakers. And I think that's a challenge to all of us, but it's why it's great, again, that you are doing this, because I think the first thing is to have to want to think it's important enough to get the facts out there to affect decision-making and affect change.
I think that brings it pretty nicely full circle there, and I'd like to thank our panelists again so much, and Tobin Smith for the stirring speech at the beginning. Thank you to all of you for coming out today. We've got a reception in the hall here where we can all mingle and have a snack before we move into the workshop portion of the afternoon. And yeah, let's just thank our speakers one more time.